The chapel was a picture of somber elegance, bathed in the muted glow of late morning light streaming through stained glass windows. Rows of pews were filled with mourners, all dressed in black, their faces downcast as they whispered condolences to one another. The scent of fresh lilies, brought by well-wishers, mingled with the faint aroma of polished wood and old stone. A soft hum from the organ drifted through the air, the melody barely audible but enough to add weight to the already sorrowful atmosphere. Sarah Grayson sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the strain. Her eyes were red and puffy, evidence of the sleepless nights and endless tears that had plagued her since her father's sudden passing. Thomas Grayson had been a pillar of strength in her life, an unshakable presence who always seemed larger than life. Now, the sight of his coffin at the front of the room made the reality of his absence hit her like a tidal wave all over again. Beside her, Bailey, her father's golden retriever, sat obediently, his leash wrapped loosely around her wrist. He was unusually quiet, his normally wagging tail still, his ears slightly perked as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. Bailey had been her father's constant companion for 7 years, a source of joy and comfort. Seeing him now, so subdued, brought an ache to Sarah's chest. The ceremony began with the priest stepping forward, his voice measured and calm as he recited the opening prayers. Guests bowed their heads, their expressions a mix of grief and reflection. Sarah tried to focus on the words, but her attention kept drifting to Bailey. The dog's posture was stiff, his eyes fixed on the coffin. Every few moments, he let out a soft whimper. "Bailey, hush," Sarah whispered, leaning down to rub his head. Her voice was gentle, but there was a hint of desperation. She needed him to be quiet, to let her focus on saying goodbye. Bailey stopped for a moment, leaning in her touch, but then he let out a low growl that sent shivers down her spine. "What's wrong with him?" asked David, her uncle, seated to her left. His tone was annoyed, but his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "He's never acted like this before." David huffed, crossing his arms as he turned back to the ceremony. Sarah tried to do the same, but Bailey's behavior only grew more peculiar. He shifted from side to side, his nose twitching as if picking up a scent. Then, without warning, he barked, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the quiet chapel. All heads turned, Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she tightened her grip on the leash. "Bailey, no," she hissed, pulling him closer. But the dog didn't stop. He barked again, his tone more urgent, then lunged forward, pulling the leash taut. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The priest paused mid-sentence, his brow creasing as he glanced towards Sarah and the dog. "Miss Grayson," he said softly, "perhaps it would be best to take the dog outside for a moment." "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered, rising to her feet. But Bailey refused to move. He planted his paws firmly on the ground, his eyes locked on the coffin. He barked once more, then began scratching at the ground as if trying to dig his way toward the front. "What's the matter with that dog?" an elderly woman muttered from the third row. "Disrespectful to bring an animal here," someone else whispered, the words dripping with judgment. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to pull Bailey back. "Bailey, stop it," she pleaded. Tears pricked her eyes, a mix of grief and frustration bubbling to the surface. "Please, just stop." But Bailey was relentless. His barks turned into growls, deep and guttural, sending a ripple of unease through the mourners. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't like him. Bailey was always well-behaved, especially in public. He never barked unless there was a reason. "What's going on?" whispered Lisa, Sarah's cousin, leaning over from the row behind. Her tone was curious, but her wide eyes betrayed her unease. "Do you think he senses something?" Sarah shook her head, though doubt was beginning to creep into her mind. Dogs were perceptive, she knew that. Bailey had always been unusually attuned to emotions and subtle changes in the environment. Was it possible he was reacting to something no one else could perceive? Before she could dwell on the thought, Bailey lunged again, his nails scraping against the polished floor. This time, He nearly pulled the leash from Sarah's grasp. His eyes were wild, his body tense, as he let out a low, mournful howl that sent chills through the room. "Sarah, control that dog!" David snapped, rising from his seat. His voice was sharp, but his expression was a mix of anger and unease. He reached for Bailey's collar, but the dog growled at him, baring his teeth in a way that made David freeze. "I think he's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She didn't know where the words came from, but the moment they left her mouth, they felt true. "Something's wrong." David opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Bailey darted forward again, dragging Sarah a few steps closer to the coffin. This time, the leash slipped from her fingers. Bailey bounded to the front of the room, his nails clicking against the floor as he reached the base of the coffin. He barked furiously, his paws scratching at the polished wood. "Bailey, no!" Sarah cried, rushing after him. The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered and murmured, their voices blending into a cacophony of confusion. Some stood, craning their necks to see what was happening. Others exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale. "Miss Grayson," the priest said, his tone stern but kind, "this is highly inappropriate. Please remove the dog." But Sarah didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched Bailey. His barking had stopped, replaced by a low, steady growl. His eyes were fixed on the coffin, his body trembling with tension. It was as if he was guarding it, or trying to warn them. "What if he's right?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs. "What if something's wrong?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. One by one, the mourners fell silent, their attention drawn to the dog who refused to look away from the coffin. For the first time that day, the grief in the room was overshadowed by something else, a growing sense of dread. The room was thick with tension, every eye fixed on Sarah as she stood by the coffin, her face pale and her breath shallow. Bailey's growls had quieted, but he remained rigid, his gaze unwavering. It was as if the dog had become a sentinel, standing guard over a secret only he could sense. Whispers filled the air like the rustling of dry leaves, faint but growing louder as the minutes ticked by. "Miss Grayson, we need to continue the service," the priest said gently, though his voice carried an edge of authority. He stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "This is not the time to let emotions dictate our actions." Sarah turned toward him, her heart pounding. "It's not emotions," she said, her voice trembling. "Bailey has never acted like this. He knows something. I can feel it." David, her uncle, groaned in frustration, standing with his arms crossed. "Sarah, you're letting grief cloud your judgment. Dogs don't have some sixth sense. He's probably just upset because your father's gone. Or maybe," came a voice from the back, "he smells something." The words sent a ripple of murmurs through the mourners, some nodding in agreement, while others shot disapproving glares. Sarah's cousin Lisa stood and walked toward her, her expression curious but concerned. "You know, animals are more perceptive than we give them credit for. Maybe it's worth checking." "This is ridiculous," David snapped. "We're at a funeral, not some supernatural mystery show. We're not opening the coffin just because the dog's being fussy." "But what if?" Lisa began, but David cut her off with a wave of his hand. "No, absolutely not." Sarah, however, couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. Bailey had always been intuitive, almost eerily so. He would sit by her father's side whenever Thomas had been unwell, refusing to leave even for meals. Once, he had barked relentlessly at a neighbor's house until the fire department arrived, discovering a small electrical fire that could have spread. This wasn't just random behavior, it was deliberate. "Urgent. I want to open it," Sarah said, her voice firmer this time. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the gathered mourners. David looked at her as though she had lost her mind. "You want to open the coffin?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. "I do, and I'm not going to ignore this. Bailey is trying to tell us something, and I need to know what it is." "This is absurd," David said, throwing his hands up. "Thomas wouldn't want this circus at his funeral. How do you know what he'd want?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. He's not here to tell us, is he? The sharpness in her tone stunned David into silence. Sarah took a shaky breath, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She turned to the funeral director, Mr. Cartwright, who stood at the edge of the room, his face carefully neutral. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, "please, can we open the coffin? Just for a moment." The man hesitated, glancing around at the murmuring guests. His profession had prepared him for many uncomfortable situations, but this was uncharted territory. Finally, he nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I must advise against it," he said. "But if this is what you truly want, I'll make the arrangements." "No," David interjected, stepping forward. "This is going too far. We have no reason to do this, and it's completely disrespectful." "We have a reason," Lisa said, crossing her arms. "Bailey, he's the reason." David glared at her. "Are you seriously siding with the dog?" "Why not?" she shot back. "He seems to have better instincts than the rest of us." The tension in the room was palpable, the guests watching the exchange as though it were a scene from a play. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about disrespect. It's about finding the truth. If there's nothing wrong, then we'll close the coffin, and that'll be the end of it. But if there is," her voice trailed off, the unspoken possibility hanging in the air like a storm cloud. David sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But when this turns out to be nothing, you'll have to explain to everyone here why you ruined your father's funeral." Sarah ignored the jab, turning back to Mr. Cartwright. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mr. Cartwright gestured for two of his assistants to step forward. The men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances, but they moved toward the coffin as instructed. The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Bailey stood a few feet away, his tail low and his ears pinned back, watching intently as the men began to unlock the latches on the coffin. The sound of the metal clasps being undone echoed in the stillness, each click like a drumbeat in Sarah's chest. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room on her, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Bailey, who stood rooted to the spot, his eyes never leaving the coffin. As the lid was lifted, a collective gasp rippled through the mourners. The men hesitated for a moment, their expressions shifting from professional composure to something closer to disbelief. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. One of the assistants glanced at Mr. Cartwright, who gave him a small nod. The man cleared his throat before speaking. "You might want to see this for yourself," he said, his voice strained. Sarah moved closer, her legs feeling like lead as she approached the coffin. Bailey followed at her side, his growls replaced by a tense silence. When she looked inside, her breath caught in her throat. Her father wasn't there. Instead, a stranger's face stared back at her, pale and lifeless, a man she had never seen before in her life. The gasps that filled the chapel were sharp and piercing, a chaotic symphony of shock and disbelief. The mourners who had gathered to say their final goodbyes to Thomas Grayson now found themselves staring in stunned silence at the contents of the coffin. Sarah felt her knees buckle as her mind tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't her father. The man lying in the coffin was a stranger. Bailey growled softly, standing at Sarah's side like a vigilant guardian. His tail was stiff, his body tense, as though ready to protect her from some unseen threat. Sarah barely noticed. Her eyes were glued to the unfamiliar face in the coffin. The man looked to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a gaunt face. He was dressed in her father's suit, the very one Sarah had chosen for him. But it was painfully clear that this was not Thomas Grayson. "What the hell is going on?" David's voice broke through the stunned silence, his tone harsh and demanding. He shoved his way to the front of the room, his face twisted with anger. "Who is this man?" The murmurs grew louder, a cacophony of confusion as mourners whispered and speculated. Some stared at the coffin in horror, while others avoided looking altogether, their discomfort evident in their averted gazes. Mr. Cartwright, the funeral director, stepped forward, his face pale and beads of sweat glistening on his brow. "I don't understand," he stammered, his voice shaking. This is impossible. The body was prepared under my supervision. I personally confirmed it was Mr. Grayson." "Well, you clearly didn't do your job properly." David snapped, his voice rising. "How does something like this happen? How do you lose a body?" "I assure you, this has never happened before," Mr. Cartwright said, his tone defensive. "There must be some mistake. I'll investigate this immediately." "Mistake?" Sarah's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She turned to Mr. Cartwright, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and fear. "This isn't a mistake. This is my father. Or at least it was supposed to be. So where is he?" "I don't know," Mr. Cartwright admitted, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. "But I promise you we'll find out." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father's body was missing, and no one had any answers. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in as the weight of the situation threatened to crush her. She reached out to steady herself, her fingers brushing against the edge of the coffin. Bailey nudged her leg, his warm presence grounding her just enough to keep her upright. "I'm calling the police," Lisa said, pulling out her phone. "This isn't something we can handle on our own." David opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer absurdity of the situation seemed to deflate him. He muttered something under his breath and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The arrival of the police only added to the chaos. 2 uniformed officers entered the chapel, their expressions a mix of professionalism and curiosity as they surveyed the scene. Officer Martinez, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, took the lead. Her partner, a younger man named Officer Blake, followed closely behind, jotting notes in a small notepad. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Martinez asked, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Sarah. "It's my father," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "His body, it's gone. This isn't him." Officer Martinez frowned, glancing at the coffin. "And you're certain of that?" "Of course I'm certain," Sarah snapped, the frustration and grief bubbling over. "I would know my own father." Officer Martinez nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I understand. We'll get to the bottom of this. But first, I need everyone here to remain calm and cooperative." The officers began questioning the mourners, trying to piece together what had happened. Mr. Cartwright offered to take them to the funeral home's preparation area, where the body had been stored prior to the service. Sarah insisted on going with them, Bailey trailing close behind. She couldn't sit idly by while her father's whereabouts remained a mystery. The walk to the preparation area felt like an eternity. The corridor was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of cleaning products and flowers. Mr. Cartwright unlocked the door with shaking hands, his keys jingling as he fumbled with the lock. Inside, the room was sterile and cold, the metal tables and storage units gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Officer Martinez surveyed the area, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You said you prepared Mr. Grayson's body yourself?" she asked. "Yes," Mr. Cartwright replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I oversaw the entire process. I don't understand how this could have happened. Could someone have accessed this room without your knowledge?" Officer Blake asked. "It's locked at all times," Mr. Cartwright said. "Only myself and my assistants have keys." "And where are your assistants now?" Martinez asked, her tone pointed. "They're in the chapel," he said, motioning toward the direction they had come from. "They've been assisting with the service all morning." Martinez exchanged a look with her partner. "We'll need to review any security footage you have," she said. "And we'll need a full list of everyone who's had access to this room in the past week." As the officers began their investigation, Sarah stood in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She felt utterly helpless, her mind racing with questions. Who was the man in the coffin? Where was her father? And why would anyone do something like this? Bailey let out a low whine, pressing his nose against her leg. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "What's happening, Bailey?" she whispered. "Why would someone take him?" Bailey didn't answer, of course. but his presence was a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. As Sarah held him close, she made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would find out the truth. Her father deserved that much, and so did she. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. Sleep had been elusive, and her dreams were a jumble of fragmented images. Her father's face, the stranger in the coffin, and Bailey barking into the endless void. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the dull throb of exhaustion behind them. Despite everything, she knew she couldn't rest. There was too much at stake, too many unanswered questions. The police investigation had been slow to yield results. Security footage from the funeral home showed no signs of forced entry, but it did reveal two shadowy figures entering the preparation room in the dead of night, dressed in uniforms identical to those worn by Mr. Cartwright's staff. The footage was grainy, the faces obscured, but it was clear that the body had been deliberately switched. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had called the police station twice already that morning, but they had no updates. The sound of Bailey's paws clicking against the hardwood floor pulled her attention away from her spiraling thoughts. He approached her with his leash in his mouth, his tail wagging slightly. "You still want to go for a walk?" she asked, her voice soft. Bailey dropped the leash at her feet and tilted his head, his expressive eyes filled with a quiet determination. Sarah sighed and stood, grabbing the leash and clipping it onto his collar. Maybe a walk would clear her head. The morning air was crisp and cool, a sharp contrast to the heaviness that weighed on Sarah's heart. She and Bailey walked in silence, the familiar rhythm of their steps providing a small measure of comfort. They passed by the park where her father had taken Bailey almost every day. The side of the bench where he used to sit, reading the newspaper while Bailey played, brought a lump to her throat. "Where are you, Dad?" she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. Bailey suddenly stopped, his body stiffening as his nose twitched. He let out a low growl and began pulling on the leash, his posture tense and purposeful. "What is it, Bailey?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. She followed him as he led her toward the edge of the park, where a narrow trail wound through a cluster of trees. Bailey's pace quickened, his nose to the ground as he followed an invisible trail. Sarah had no choice but to keep up. The trail ended at a clearing, where an old, abandoned shed stood. Its wooden planks were weathered and cracked, the windows grimy and coated with dust. Bailey barked sharply, his tail straight as he approached the door. "Bailey, wait," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, but Bailey was relentless. He pawed at the door, barking again as if urging her to open it. Sarah swallowed her fear and stepped forward, her hand shaking as she reached for the rusted handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air, making her gag. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight to illuminate the room. At first, it seemed empty. Old tools and crates were scattered across the floor, and cobwebs hung in the corners. But as Sarah stepped inside, her light caught something in the far corner, a large, rectangular object covered with a tarp. Bailey barked again, his nose pointing directly at the tarp. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she approached it. Her hands trembled as she reached out and pulled the tarp away. What she saw made her stomach lurch. A wooden box, eerily similar to a coffin, lay beneath the tarp. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this where her father's body had been hidden? And if so, who had put it here? And why? Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah knelt down and opened the box. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked inside. It wasn't her father, but the sight was no less shocking. Documents, photographs, and stacks of cash were packed tightly into the box. The photographs showed her father shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize, both of them standing in front of a construction site. The documents bore the letterhead of a real estate development company, one Sarah had heard her father mention only in passing. "What is this?" she murmured, sifting through the papers. Her father's handwriting appeared on several pages, detailing what looked like a series of illegal transactions involving land purchases and zoning permits. The words bribery and fraud jumped out at her, sending a chill down her spine. Bailey barked again, his eyes fixed on a shadow moving outside the shed. Sarah froze, clutching the papers tightly. The sound of footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Her mind raced. She stuffed the documents back into the box and slid it into the corner, covering it with the tarp once more. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the dilapidated shed. His expression was cold, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The man ignored her question, stepping closer. "This is private property. I suggest you leave." Sarah took a step back, her hands tightening on Bailey's leash. "Not until you tell me what happened to my father." The man's eyes narrowed. "Your father shouldn't have meddled in things he didn't understand. He brought this on himself." "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded. "Where is he? What did you do to him?" The man smirked, but before he could answer, Bailey lunged forward, barking furiously. The man flinched, stepping back as Sarah took the opportunity to dart past him and out of the shed. Bailey followed, his growls echoing in the still morning air. Sarah didn't stop running until she was back on the main road, her heart pounding as she clutched Bailey's leash. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting the man to be following her, but the road was empty. Back at home, Sarah spread the documents across the kitchen table. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together. Her father had uncovered something big, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, and they had silenced him to protect their secrets. But Sarah wasn't going to let them win. With Bailey by her side, she picked up her phone and dialed the number for Officer Martinez. It was time to bring the truth to light, no matter what it took.